December 1941 marked the beginning of the Pacific War. For the US Navy, the role of frontline fighter was chiefly filled by the F4F Wildcat, a simple but robust design. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, it was the A6M Zero, a lightweight and highly agile aircraft. Both were radial engine, carrier-capable designs. During this early war period, Japanese and American pilots alike viewed the Zero as arguably the most versatile naval fighter in the world, and perhaps the best fighter aircraft until 1942. In fact, the Zero's reputation played into the suspicion of Japanese invincibility, a belief held by many Americans before the Battle of Midway broke this illusion. However, looking past reputation and pilot skill, both the Wildcat and Zero possessed several similarities. So how did these aircraft actually compare as machines? And was the Wildcat actually undercredited as a fighter? Both the Zero and Wildcat have similar histories, albeit following different principles. In 1936, the US Navy made the decision to transition from biplanes to monoplanes, ordering the F-2A Buffalo, a heavy yet agile fighter at the time. The Grumman X F4F had been drawn up as a backup, although in its archaic form, the concept was deemed inferior to the Buffalo. Major redesigns followed, and the XF4F3 emerged revised, with far better overall performance and design logic. The aircraft was scheduled to enter service in October 1940. From its inception, the Wildcat was designed to focus on maritime operations, particularly carrier operations. Sticking to American principles, it was large, heavy, armed with machine guns rather than cannons, and from 1941 onwards, with the F4F4, further standardized for carrier employment with folding wings, adding further weight. The Zero, on the other hand, would differ greatly, though emerging out of similar desires. In 1937, Mitsubishi's A5M was the world's first low-wing monoplane to enter service as a Navy fighter. While engaged in the Second Sino-Japanese War, the A5M was contextually good for mid-range operations, engaging Chinese P-26s in what would be the first ever combat between metal-built monoplanes. During the opening months of its use, it was noted as being almost completely dominant in Asia. Despite its early success, by late 1937, new proposal requests were sent out to manufacturers. The Navy understood that the regional war in Asia could expand. If a war in the Pacific were to start, it would be a rush to secure the Malay archipelago and subsequently the many islands scattered beyond it. In the age of carriers, aircraft range would play a crucial role in expanding the spheres of reconnaissance, offense, and defense. A request for proposal was issued, detailing the need for a new carrier-based fighter. It would need to be as light as possible, capable of operating at high performance for 2 hours or cruising for over 6. The response was the Type 0 carrier fighter, manufactured by Mitsubishi and designed by Jiro Horikoshi. It exceeded expectations, relying on a new, highly secretive zinc-based alloy, Alduralumin, which offers significant weight reduction and rigidity. Introduced in July 1940, it saw combat in China before being employed infamously during the attack on Pearl Harbor the next year. Throughout 1940, as has sometimes been highlighted, it has been claimed that Japanese analysts who had studied aerial engagements in Europe, namely the Battle of France and the Battle of Britain, had speculated that the Zero would dominate against both sides if forced into such a conflict. This may have been true, with Zero Ace Saburo Sakai going so far as to claim that if the Germans had access to the Zero, the Battle of Britain would have been over quickly, given the far better mission endurance and range, paired with superior agility to the early Spitfire. Both the Wildcat and Zero were thus adapted to very different Navy expectations and goals. Let's take a closer look at each design, its advantages and disadvantages, starting with the A6M. The Zero was lightweight, constructed from thin materials and delicate to handle. In combat, this meant that only a few rounds from a machine gun could see the aircraft go up in flames, as was often the case. In a similar manner, the simple engine design struggled at higher altitudes and was prone to cutting out if the pilot pulled neutral or negative Gs due to float-type carburetor fuel flow issues. Finally, its delicate design was prohibited from going fast, especially in a dive, which would lock up the controls or completely shear off the wings in rare cases. However, if kept within its parameters, the Zero was unmatched early on. Specifically, at mid and low speeds, it had great agility. The Zero had several advantages at low speeds, which it maintained throughout the war. Notably, its unique wing and tail design allowed it to reach near-stalling speeds while still maintaining control. This was useful in dogfights when pulling enemy aircraft into a vertical turn. Likewise, when being pursued, Zero pilots could pull into the vertical, climbing until reaching stall speed, avoiding the nose of the pursuing plane. In practice early on, American aircraft would be forced to either overshoot or, if controlling throttle to remain behind the Zero, would enter a stall. At this point in a fight, the pursuit aircraft would be forced to wait until sufficient momentum allowed for a reversal of the turn. In contrast, the Zero could achieve reversal even at the peak of the stall with rudder inputs, while a horizontal stabilizer moved further up the airframe, prevented turbulence generated from the elevators at high angles of attack from buffeting against the rudder. This tailplane design also allowed for a unique maneuver during a two-circle fight, referred to as a twist inside, or Hineri-komi, which enabled Zero pilots to pull the fight into a vertical loop, side slip, and then close down their turn circle to bring the Zero behind the pursuing aircraft. These specific scenarios were quickly noted by the US Navy, and pilots were soon instructed to avoid dogfighting the Zero, instead focusing on high-speed hit-and-run tactics, which the Zero couldn't counter due to speed limitations. From June 1942 onwards, after successful testing at Midway, the US Navy introduced a new tactic for the Wildcats to counter the Japanese Hineri-komi maneuver. Referred to as the beam defense, it involved two Wildcats beaming an enemy at opposite angles, then weaving between each other and repeating. Once an enemy was committed to a target, the weave would be repeated, overlapping the enemy's turn circle with that of the second Wildcat. This weave could be repeated multiple times until the second Wildcat could hit the target. The tactic gave even inexperienced Wildcat pilots a chance to match up against the Zero. However, more experienced Japanese pilots could overcome it, for example, by leading the turn into the vertical slightly before the merge, forcing at least one of the Wildcats to compromise their maneuver in order to avoid being shot at from above, or by exploiting weaknesses in deflection shooting. Overall, however, these were the exceptions. For the most part, the Thach Weave, as it would eventually be renamed, was a good tactic, giving the Wildcat the advantage it needed to secure victory over an attacking Zero, something that was previously very hard. The Zero was, in practice, a light, agile, and highly capable design. However, it had flaws from the outset. Its engine offered great long-range performance, but it hindered the aircraft's performance at high altitudes. Its lack of armor and self-sealing tanks meant both pilot and machine were at risk from just one well-placed shot. For the Wildcat, there were far fewer advantages. However, the few it possessed were substantial. The greatest advantage was its armor. Built out of far stronger materials, the Wildcat was a heavier but more sturdy design all around. An armored cockpit offered better pilot protection, self-sealing fuel tanks improved survivability, and overall, the entire aircraft could take far more hits than its adversary. Beyond this, a two-stage supercharged engine offered better high-altitude performance, something the Zero famously lacked. This gave the Wildcat the ability to, with enough foresight, simply outclimb an adversary at high altitude and attack through the dive if need be. The trade-off to all of this was, of course, weight, which proved a point of fatigue for some pilots. To add to this, the folding wings further weighed down the aircraft, and once airborne, these limitations became noticeable. Firstly, its range was limited, a distinct disadvantage from the Zero. In combat, the design proved cumbersome, with a significantly slower climb rate, top speed, and turn rate compared to the Japanese fighter. Additionally, The cruise speed was approximately 150 knots. It was noted that if jumped by enemy aircraft, the Wildcat was too slow in its acceleration to really fight back. There were obvious exceptions and tactics around this, but on a fundamental level, it was slow. Such disadvantages culminated in a series of combat limitations. This was noted during attempts to escort strike missions, during which limited range and numbers meant Avenger and Dauntless pilots had to engage in dogfights themselves during ingress or egress from the target, as the Wildcats were usually held back in some capacity. This would culminate in the chaos at Midway. While Wildcats held the line during this battle, several incidents were noted by commanders as extremely troublesome. For example, the USS Hornet's strike aircraft were massacred by Japanese fighters. The reason was that 10 VF-8 Wildcats had been forced to ditch into the ocean following a botched mission, and with limited fuel stores, they were unable to return to the carrier. It was moments like these that helped propel newer Navy designs into service. Arguably, the most significant factor contributing to the Zero's early success was the skill of their pilots. As noted by American and Australian pilots, the Japanese were not only well-trained, but many pilots who deployed to the Pacific Theater already had years of combat experience from the war in China. There was no comparable experience for US Navy pilots. As the war progressed, this advantage was lost. While the Japanese were noted for possessing superior precision in their attacks, better machines and tactics midway through the war meant that US Navy pilots could evade and successfully defeat even more experienced pilots in the Zero, offsetting the previously established balance. The biggest disadvantage in this regard was the accessibility of the Zero. As noted by fighter ace Saburo Sakai, the A6M was a touchy design with a steep learning curve. While certain American aircraft, like the Corsair, had similar skill curves for the most part, the Wildcat and its eventual derivatives were easy to learn on. It was noted by Sakai that younger, inexperienced pilots on the Zero would often push the inputs too far, either putting themselves at a disadvantage or, in some cases, pulling the wings off their own aircraft. A final two considerations regard timing and context. For the first year of the war, the Wildcat was the Navy's heavy lifter. Its role in the Pacific is often overlooked in favor of the Corsair or Hellcat. However, when considering the context, by the time both latter designs arrived in force, the war in the Pacific had already shifted in favor of the Allies. Thus, while clearly reaching its limits, the Wildcat held the line throughout 1942, arguably the most critical period of the entire war, and emerged on top. However, on the other hand, during this period, the Japanese were primarily on the offensive, while the US was in a defensive posture near Australia. This has been noted as potentially affecting victory counts for two reasons. Firstly, in a defensive setting, US aircraft usually had ample warning of incoming Japanese aircraft and could operate within a smaller radius of self-defense. Secondly, the attacking Japanese, lacking ground radar installations when on the offensive, often flew near the limits of their combat radius, which potentially held them back due to this dynamic. So let's compare the two aircraft directly in terms of technical capability. On paper, both aircraft are cutting edge for their time. The F4F would be powered by a Pratt & Whitney 14-cylinder radial piston engine, the R1830, which would see upgrades throughout the war. In the F4F3, it would produce roughly 1,200 horsepower. The Zero's power plant would be the Nakajima Sakai, also a 14-cylinder air-cooled engine, producing around 940 horsepower in the Sakai 12. Though much later, the Japanese Navy would sometimes boost the Sakai 21 engines with a water-methanol mix, resulting in roughly equal power output to the R1830. However, even with this increase in power, a lack of equally powerful forced induction solutions meant that high-altitude performance would still be limited. In terms of altitude, both aircraft had drastically different service ceilings. The Zero could operate up to 33,000 feet, while the Wildcat could reach 39,500 feet. Both aircraft had similar top speeds of around 530 kilometers per hour. However, the Wildcat would lag behind in several areas, as it had a lower climb rate of 2,300 feet per minute compared to the Zero's 3,050. The Wildcat held a maximum range of 1,360 kilometers, significantly below the Zero's maximum of over 3,000 kilometers. In terms of weight, the Zero came in at 1,680 kilograms, 3,700 pounds, empty. The Wildcat was significantly heavier, weighing approximately 4,900 pounds, 2,200 kilograms, empty. In regard to armament, the Wildcat, like most US aircraft from World War II, stuck to the tried and tested Browning 50 caliber. Initially, the aircraft would carry 4 such M2 Browning machine guns, 2 on each wing. This was then upgraded to a 6-gun setup, which received mixed reactions from pilots, with some preferring the earlier 4-gun setup. The aircraft could also carry bombs if needed, 2 100-pound bombs, rockets, or 2 58-gallon, 220-litre drop tanks, both mounted on underwing pylons. Later, FM2s could carry rockets and a centerline tank. The Zero would carry a mixture of weapons. In the engine cowling, 2 7.7mm Type 97 machine guns would be mounted, while 2 20mm Type 99 Mark III cannons would be mounted in the wings. It could also carry a pair of 130-pound bombs, and by the late war could field a single 550-pound bomb. Lastly, it could carry drop tanks, the most common being a centerline tank with a 320-litre capacity. Later, it was made capable of carrying a pair of 150-litre underwing tanks, which were later expanded to 330-litre pairs in the A6M3. And finally, more aerodynamic 350-litre pairs in the A6M7. The key advantage in the case of later A6M variants was the ability to carry both wing-mounted tanks and a single 550-pound bomb on the centerline. The Wildcat, as noted, did not possess this ability. While early war versions of the aircraft could be fitted with a centerline tank, no standardized method of loading centerline weapons was possible. Hence, either drop tanks or air-to-ground munitions had to be chosen. By the end of the war, the Wildcat had accounted for roughly 1,000 kills, forming almost 60 ace pilots on the airframe. Overall, the F4F had a kill ratio of 6.9 to 1, up from an initial 5.9 to 1 in 1942, indicating how the chances of victory favored the Americans as the war progressed. While modest in comparison to other fighters of the era, both the kill count and ratio demonstrate that the design was still adaptable and capable of holding its own. In contrast, by the end of the war, the A6M Zero would have emerged with a final kill count of around 1,500 aircraft, while the final kill ratio by war's end remains a matter of debate. For the first half of the war, it stood at roughly 12 to 1 due to the magnitude of the initial advantage. Ultimately, both aircraft were mass-produced on a grand scale. 7,885 Wildcats would be built, and 10,939 A6M Zeros. The Zero served for 5 years in total. From its prototype in April 1939, it was rushed into combat, first being deployed in July 1940 and immediately seeing action over China during the Second Sino-Japanese War. Its most infamous usage would be as a lead fighter during the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. From there, the rest is history. The Zero would serve in practically every military engagement in the Pacific War in some capacity. The Wildcat was a similar story. A common misconception holds that the Wildcat was simply phased out as newer designs emerged. However, the F4F would serve with units for the entirety of the war, performing support, escort, and combat air patrol duties, among others. It saw its greatest success with the Marines, forging several aces. Again, misconceptions portray the aircraft as a heavy, archaic platform, but in reality, when it was introduced in December 1940, it featured one of the most proven and reliable radial engines of the time. It too would see service in almost every major engagement during the Pacific War. In the final analysis, there is little doubt that even with equally skilled pilots, the Zero was simply a better dogfighter. Its greatest disadvantage was its lack of ingenuity as the war progressed. The design was good for its time, but quickly became nearly irrelevant as faster aircraft with better high-altitude performance became standardized. What's more, the Zero also had a steep learning curve. One of the greatest strengths of the Wildcat was its robust design, which allowed it to withstand repeated hits and still return home. And it was this advantage that led to victory. The Wildcat would go up against superior Japanese fighters again and again, often emerging victorious in many of the most important engagements of the Pacific War, including those at Guadalcanal, the Coral Sea, and Midway. Both aircraft share a similar history, emerging in the same year as cutting-edge early war Navy fighters. Both were surpassed by a newer generation of fighter aircraft, yet both nonetheless continued fighting until the final day of the war. Although overshadowed by the Hellcat and Corsair, the Wildcat stands with the P-40 Warhawk as the aircraft that helped defend the Allies during the critical opening months of the Pacific War, a claim none of its successors can make. Likewise, the Zero, despite its slow decline, holds claims no other Japanese fighter can make. It was the tip of the spear for the Imperial Japanese Navy during its bid for dominance in the Pacific, and for the first year of the war, it may have been the most feared and respected fighter aircraft in the world, playing a part in forging the myth of Japanese invincibility. Which was the better design? The Zero was a work of art, precisely engineered, touchy to handle, and deadly in the right hands. The Wildcat was a tank, capable of keeping even the newest pilots safe as they went up against experienced Japanese pilots. They are both legends in their own right, and so the better aircraft was no doubt determined in the moment, dependent on the circumstances, and pilots in the fight.